You need to move.
He's not breathing. Let me...
Ma'am, step back. Now.
Please, just a second.
That's enough. Let's go.
You're pulling me off him.
The New Orleans sun was a benevolent tyrant, beating down on Jackson Square with a humid, heavy warmth that made the air thick enough to taste. It was the kind of afternoon that slowed time, blurring the edges of the city's frantic energy into a lazy, saxophone-laced hum. For Sarah Jones, it was a rare and precious gift, a day off, no beeping monitors, no sterile white walls, no life-or-death decisions hanging on the rhythm of her hands. She was just another person in the crowd, a 34-year-old ICU nurse enjoying the anonymity of a tourist in her own city, a lukewarm beignet in one hand and a book in the other. She'd found a spot on a bench under the partial shade of a magnolia tree, watching the chaotic ballet of street performers, caricature artists, and wandering visitors unfold before the iconic backdrop of the St. Louis Cathedral. She was tracing the outline of the spires with her eyes, lost in the simple peace of the moment, when a shift in the crowd's rhythm caught her attention. It wasn't a loud noise, but a sudden, discordant ripple in the human current, a collective gasp, a scattering of bodies, a small clearing forming in the dense throng of people near the center of the square. Sarah's eyes, trained by a decade of emergency room and intensive care experience, instantly focused on the epicenter of the disturbance. A man was on the ground. He wasn't stumbling. He had dropped as if his strings had been cut. For a fraction of a second, she was just an observer. Then, instinct, honed by thousands of hours of relentless training, took over. It was a switch flipping in her brain, shutting down the off-duty civilian and activating the medical professional. She saw the scene not as a chaotic spectacle, but as a series of data points. Male, mid-50s, tourist attire, clutching his chest before he fell. His face, visible for a brief moment before he crumpled, was ashen, beaded with a sweat that had nothing to do with the Louisiana heat. The diagnosis screamed through her mind with chilling certainty: massive cardiac event. "Somebody call 911!" a woman shrieked, her voice thin with panic. Sarah was already moving. She dropped her book and the half-eaten beignet, the powdered sugar dusting the stone walkway like a forgotten ghost. "I'm a nurse!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the rising panic with a calm authority that made people turn. "Let me through! Everybody back up!" The crowd parted for her, a sea of bewildered faces creating a path to the fallen man. She dropped to her knees beside him on the hot flagstones, the rough surface digging into her skin, but she didn't feel it. Her world had narrowed to the space occupied by the unconscious man. His name, she would later learn, was Michael Evans, but in that moment, he was simply her patient. She pressed 2 fingers to his carotid artery, searching for the familiar, life-affirming beat. Nothing. A flicker of movement in his chest, a pathetic, gasping attempt at breath, a gonal breathing, the last, desperate reflex of a dying brain. He was in full cardiac arrest. "He's not breathing. I have no pulse," she announced to the circle of onlookers. Not for their benefit, but to solidify the protocol in her own mind. This was her space now. This square was her ICU. She tilted his head back, checked his airway for obstructions, and then positioned her hands, one interlocked over the other, in the center of his sternum. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. She began to count, her voice a steady metronome against the soundtrack of the city's rising panic. She poured all her strength, all her training, all her focus into the rhythmic compressions, pushing hard and fast, trying to manually force the man's heart to do the job it had so suddenly abandoned. She was vaguely aware of the world around her. The frantic voice of someone on the phone with a 911 dispatcher, the distant wail of a siren that was still too far away, the press of bodies forming a wall of useless, horrified spectators, but none of it mattered. Her reality was the give of the man's ribs beneath her hands, the sweat dripping from her own brow onto his still chest, and the relentless count that was the only thing standing between him and irreversible death. For Michael Evans, the clock had stopped. For Sarah Jones, every fraction of a second had become an eternity, each compression a desperate plea against the encroaching silence. The vibrant, sun-drenched afternoon had become a life-or-death struggle on the cold, hard stones of Jackson Square. The siren grew from a distant cry to a piercing shriek, culminating in the guttural roar of a diesel engine and the squeal of brakes. A police cruiser, lights strobing in a chaotic red and blue rhythm against the historic facades, had arrived. Sarah didn't look up. Her focus was absolute. Her arms burned, a deep ache setting into her shoulders. But she maintained the rhythm, 100 compressions per minute, hard and fast. The mantra of basic life support. The patient's color hadn't improved. He was still a ghastly shade of gray, his lips tinged with blue. She was losing him. Heavy footsteps approached. The confident, solid sound of boots on pavement. A shadow fell over her and her patient. "All right, folks, back it up. Give us some room here. NOPD. Everybody clear the area." The voice was young, sharp, and imbued with an unshakable sense of command. "I'm a registered nurse," Sarah said, not breaking her rhythm, her words coming out in clipped pants between compressions. "He's in full cardiac arrest. No pulse, not breathing. I've been doing CPR for about 4 minutes." She was providing a medical handoff, assuming the officer was there to secure the scene for the paramedics who were hopefully right behind him. "I need you to clear the area." "Ma'am," the officer repeated, his tone unchanged. It was the voice of someone following a script for whom the specifics of the situation were irrelevant. The primary objective was control. Sarah finally risked a glance upward. The officer was young, probably late 20s, with a sharp, angular face and a haircut that was military short. His name tag read Renslow. He wasn't looking at the patient. He was looking at the crowd, at the dozens of cell phones now held aloft, recording the entire scene. His priority was the optics, the perimeter. "I can't stop," Sarah said, her voice strained with effort. "He'll die. Brain death starts in 4 to 6 minutes. We're already there." "The paramedics are on their way," Renslow said, his voice laced with impatience. "My job right now is to secure this scene. That means everyone moves, including you." The statement was so profoundly illogical, so contrary to every principle of emergency response, that Sarah's brain struggled to process it. Move? Move where? Abandon the only action keeping oxygenated blood flowing to this man's brain? She looked from the officer's polished boots to Michael Evans's still, gray face. "Officer, with all due respect, I am the only thing keeping this man alive right now. I will not stop until the EMTs are here and ready to take over. You need to help with the crowd, but you cannot move me." She had made a critical error, though she didn't realize it at the time. She hadn't just refused an order, she had told him how to do his job. A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even anger, crossed Renslow's face. He saw a civilian challenging his authority in front of an audience. He didn't see a medical professional performing a sacred duty. "Ma'am, this is a direct order from a police officer. Step away from the man now." "No," Sarah said, the word a final, unequivocal statement of fact. She turned her full attention back to her patient, locking her arms and resuming the count, putting more force into it now, as if her sheer will could restart his heart. The world around her had become a buzzing, indistinct haze. There was only the man beneath her hands, the officer, Mark Renslow, had been with the New Orleans Police Department for 5 years. He'd learned a simple, effective worldview in that time. Situations were either controlled or uncontrolled. His job was to impose control. A crowd with cell phones pointed at a medical emergency was an uncontrolled variable. A civilian refusing a direct order was a direct challenge to the very foundation of that control. He didn't see a patient, he saw a problem. He didn't hear a nurse, he heard an obstacle. His training, his experience, his entire professional identity was built around the principle that compliance was non-negotiable. He took another step forward, placing himself directly in Sarah's line of sight, his posture shifting from authoritative to aggressive. The clash was no longer just about procedure, it had become a personal contest of wills, played out over the body of a dying man. And Officer Renslow was not accustomed to losing. "This is your last chance, ma'am." Officer Renslow's voice was low, cutting through the ambient noise of the square with a chilling finality. "Get up and step away from him." Sarah didn't even look at him this time. Every ounce of her being was focused on the task at hand. The man's chest rose and fell under the force of her compressions. In her mind, she was running through the advanced cardiac life support, ACLS protocols she knew by heart. She was calculating dosages of epinephrine, thinking about defibrillation, anticipating the questions the paramedics would ask the second they arrived. She was in the zone, a place of pure medical function where outside distractions ceased to exist. "I have a duty to care," she panted, the words more for herself than for him. "I will not abandon my patient." For Renslow, that was the final provocation. The crowd was growing, their phones like 100 unblinking eyes. He could feel their judgment, their focus shifting from the medical drama to the confrontation he was creating. In his mind, he was losing control of the narrative, of the scene itself. His authority, challenged so publicly, had to be reasserted in the most decisive way possible. He made a decision that would alter the course of multiple lives, a choice born not of malice, but of a profound and dangerous rigidity. He reached down and grabbed Sarah's shoulder. "You're under arrest," he said, the words sharp and clear. The shock of his touch was like an electric jolt. But her hands didn't stop. They couldn't. It was muscle memory, a sacred contract. "For what?" she asked, disbelief coloring her voice. "For saving a man's life? For obstructing a police investigation and refusing to obey a lawful order," he recited, the formal charge sounding utterly surreal in the context of the life-and-death struggle happening on the pavement. He tugged harder on her arm, trying to pull her off the patient. "Stop! You're going to kill him!" Sarah cried out, twisting to keep her hands in place. The rhythm was broken. For a precious second, the compressions ceased. In that horrifying pause, Michael Evans was truly, completely dead. Renslow was committed now. There was no backing down. He unclipped his handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click was obscenely loud in the suddenly quieted square. The crowd gasped, a single unified sound of disbelief. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." It was an impossible choice. Cooperate and condemn the man on the ground to certain death, or resist and escalate a situation that had already spiraled into madness. But for Sarah, it wasn't a choice at all. Her primary directive was unwavering. Primum non nocere. First, do no harm. Abandoning CPR was the ultimate harm. She planted her feet, locked her arms, and tried to resume compressions, her body a shield over her patient. "No, I'm not stopping." That was all Renslow needed. He saw it as physical resistance. He grabbed her arm with both hands and wrenched her backwards, away from Michael Evans. Sarah stumbled, crying out as she was pulled off balance. Her patient was left alone, a still figure on the hot stones. The fragile chain of survival she had forged was shattered. Renslow spun her around with surprising force, her arms pinned behind her back before she could even process what was happening. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into her wrists, cinching down tight. The sound of the ratchet locking was the sound of a line being crossed that could never be uncrossed. She was a nurse, a healer, and she was in handcuffs, arrested for the crime of refusing to stop saving a life. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes wild with a mixture of fury and despair. She saw Michael Evans lying still and abandoned. She saw the crowd, their faces a mixture of shock and outrage. She saw Officer Renslow, his expression hard and unyielding, convinced he was in the right, that he was restoring order to a chaotic scene. But he hadn't restored order. He had imposed a death sentence, interrupting the one thing that was giving Michael Evans a chance to live. The sun beat down, indifferent. On the tableau of misguided justice, a life hanging in the balance while the person fighting for it was led away in chains. The interior of the NOPD cruiser was a cage of black plastic and scratched plexiglass, smelling faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. It was stiflingly hot. Renslow shoved Sarah into the back seat without a word, the plastic bench hard and slick against her legs. The door slammed shut with a heavy, metallic finality, severing her from the world outside. Through the thick, barred window, Jackson Square looked like a silent movie, a scene of frantic action stripped of its sound. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm that stood in stark contrast to the stillness she had been fighting in her patient. Her wrists ached where the handcuffs dug into her skin, a raw, chafing pressure that was a constant reminder of the situation's insanity. But her most profound sensation was one of utter, sickening helplessness. Her gaze was locked on the small, abandoned circle where Michael Evans still lay. The crowd, which Renslow had been so desperate to control, was now an agitated, angry mob, their voices a muffled roar through the glass. Several were yelling directly at the officer, their phones still recording his every move. Just then, the wail of a different siren crescendoed, and an ambulance from the New Orleans EMS screeched to a halt, lights painting the scene in flashes of red and white. 2 paramedics burst from the vehicle, their movements economical and urgent. They were a blur of blue uniforms and life-saving equipment. One dropped a heavy medical bag and a defibrillator beside the patient while the other took over CPR, seamlessly picking up the rhythm Sarah had been forced to abandon. Sarah pressed her face against the hot window, her breath fogging the glass. She watched them work, her mind screaming a litany of clinical questions. How long was he down without compressions? A minute? 90 seconds? An eternity in neurological time? Did they get an IV started? What was his rhythm on the monitor? V-fib? Asystole? Every second they worked was a second she had lost. A second Renslow had stolen from a dying man. She recognized one of the paramedics, a man named David Chin, someone she'd handed off patients to in the ER dozens of times. He was a good medic, calm under pressure. She watched as he and his partner worked with a desperate efficiency, attaching defibrillator pads to Michael's chest, charging the machine, and then the convulsive jump of the man's body as the electricity shot through him. Once, twice. They were fighting a battle that was now harder to win because of the interruption. David glanced up, his eyes scanning the scene, and his gaze met Sarah's through the cruiser window. Confusion, then disbelief. Then a flash of anger crossed his face. He knew who she was. He knew what her presence in the back of a police car meant. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head before turning his attention back to the patient. It was a moment of silent communication, a shared understanding between 2 medical professionals of the gross injustice unfolding. Renslow climbed into the driver's seat, the car dipping with his weight. He started the engine, the air conditioning blasting to life. But it did nothing to cool the rage and frustration burning inside Sarah. He didn't look back at her. He busied himself with the radio, his voice a low, clipped murmur as he reported the situation. Scene is secure. One in custody for 14 to 108, resisting an officer. Not a word about the medical emergency. Not a hint of the context, just the sterile, self-justifying language of a police report. The paramedics finally got Michael Evans onto a stretcher, his chest still being rhythmically compressed by an automated device, an oxygen mask strapped to his face. They loaded him into the back of the ambulance with a practiced, desperate speed. The doors slammed shut. As the ambulance pulled away, its sirens screaming, carving a path through the city streets. Sarah watched it go, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. That was her patient, a man whose life had been in her hands, now being rushed to a hospital by colleagues while she sat arrested, a prisoner of a system that had prioritized a uniformed ego over a human life. The silence in the car was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the radio, a sound that now seemed to her like the static of a world gone completely wrong. The drive to the 8th District Station on Royal Street was short and silent. Officer Renslow navigated the narrow French Quarter streets with a tense, jerky precision, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Sarah sat in the back, her mind a whirlwind. She cycled through the events in the square, replaying every word, every action, searching for a logic that wasn't there. She had followed her training. She had upheld her oath. And for that, she was being treated like a criminal. The initial shock was hardening into a cold, clear anger, an indignation that pushed back against the fear and helplessness. The station's booking area was a drab, institutional space of cinder-block walls and flickering fluorescent lights. The air smelled of stale paper and floor cleaner. As Renslow led her toward the booking desk, a few officers looked up, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and indifference. A new arrest was routine. But then they saw her. She wasn't the usual suspect. She was a woman in civilian clothes, her face streaked with sweat and tears of frustration, her hands cuffed behind her back. The desk sergeant was a man named Miller, a 25-year veteran with a weary face and eyes that had seen everything the city had to offer. He looked up from his paperwork as they approached, his gaze lingering on Sarah before shifting to Renslow. "What do you have, Mark?" Miller asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "One in custody, resisting an officer, obstruction of a governmental operation," Renslow said, his tone still clipped and defensive. He nudged Sarah forward toward the desk. Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked at Sarah again, taking in her appearance, the sensible shoes, the clean professional demeanor beneath the distress. This didn't fit the charge. "Obstruction of what?" he asked, leaning back in his chair, his pen resting on the blotter. "She was interfering with scene control at a medical emergency in Jackson Square," Renslow explained, pulling out his notepad. "Refused multiple direct orders to clear the area." A long silence hung in the air. Miller's gaze was steady, unblinking. "A medical emergency? Was she a bystander?" "She claimed she was a nurse," Renslow said, the word claimed dripping with skepticism. "And was she?" Miller pressed. "I didn't have time to verify her credentials. She was non-compliant." Renslow insisted, his defensiveness growing. "The scene was chaotic." Miller looked at Sarah, a question in his eyes. "My name is Sarah Jones," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "I'm a registered nurse at Tulane Medical Center, ICU. The man was in full cardiac arrest. I was performing CPR when Officer Renslow arrived and ordered me to stop. I refused. I was not interfering. I was providing life-saving medical care. The simple, factual statement landed in the quiet room with the weight of an anchor. The other officers in the booking area, who had been feigning indifference, were now listening intently. Miller's expression didn't change, but a subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. The air of routine procedure evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable tension. The desk sergeant had handled thousands of arrests. He knew a bad one when he saw it. This one smelled terrible. He slowly picked up his pen. "All right, Mark, go write your report. I'll handle the booking." It was a dismissal. Renslow hesitated for a moment, wanting to say more, to justify himself further, but he seemed to recognize the futility of it in Miller's stoic gaze. He turned and walked toward a desk, the swagger in his step noticeably diminished. Miller turned his attention to Sarah. His voice was softer now. "Let's get these cuffs off you." He unlocked the restraints, and Sarah brought her arms forward, rubbing her raw wrists. The feeling of freedom in her hands was immediate and overwhelming. "Do you have identification, Miss Jones?" "It's in my purse," she said, "which I dropped in the square." "We'll have an officer retrieve your property," Miller said. He began the process, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't treating her like a criminal. He was treating her like a problem that had landed on his desk, a problem his young, overzealous officer had created. As he typed her information into the system, he paused. "So you were actively performing CPR when he arrested you?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "I told him the man would die if I stopped." Miller stared at the computer screen for a long moment, then let out a slow, quiet sigh. He didn't need to see Renslow's report. He didn't need to hear from witnesses. He knew, with the certainty of a man who understood the intricate, often messy interface between law enforcement and emergency services, that this was going to be a very, very bad day for the NOPD. The silence in the precinct wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of a legal and public relations time bomb beginning to tick. Sarah was placed in a holding cell, a small, concrete box with a metal bench and a lingering smell of desperation. The heavy door clanged shut, the sound echoing the finality she felt in her soul. She sat on the cold bench, the adrenaline from the confrontation finally draining away, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and a sense of surreal detachment. She could see the booking area through a small, wire-meshed window in the door. She watched the mundane activity of the station, the officers coming and going, the routine paperwork, a world operating on a set of rules that had suddenly turned against her. She had been in the cell for less than an hour, lost in a looping replay of the arrest, when a woman in a sharp, dark gray business suit appeared outside the door. She was in her late 40s, with a presence that seemed to command the space around her. She carried a leather briefcase and wore an expression of focused, no-nonsense intensity. She conferred briefly with Sergeant Miller, who pointed toward Sarah's cell. The woman walked to the door and looked through the window, her eyes meeting Sarah's. "Sarah Jones?" she asked, her voice clear and strong. Sarah stood up and walked to the door. "Yes." "My name is Eleanor Vance," the woman said. "I'm an attorney with the Louisiana State Nurses Association's Legal Defense Fund. Your colleague, David Chen, the paramedic at the scene, called his supervisor as soon as they cleared the hospital. His supervisor called the union. They called me. I'm here to get you out." A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled. Sarah's knees washed over her. She wasn't alone. The system she was a part of was already moving to protect her. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Save your thanks, Eleanor said, though not unkindly. Let's get to work. Sergeant Miller is letting me use an interview room. He's cooperative. She gave a slight nod toward the desk sergeant, who was studiously avoiding looking in their direction. Moments later, Sarah was sitting across from Eleanor Vance at a small table in a sterile, windowless room. The lawyer opened her briefcase, pulling out a legal pad and a pen. "Tell me everything," she instructed. "Start from the moment you saw the man collapse. Don't editorialize. Don't guess what the officer was thinking. Just give me the facts. In order. Every word you remember. Every action. Be precise." Sarah took a deep breath and began. She recounted the story in the same methodical way she would deliver a patient report to another nurse at a shift change. She detailed her initial assessment, the lack of pulse, the agonal breathing, the start of CPR. She described Officer Renslow's arrival, his focus on the crowd, his repeated demands for her to move. She recited their conversation as best she could remember it, her refusal, and the sudden, violent arrest. Eleanor listened intently, her pen flying across the page, her expression unreadable. She would occasionally interject with a sharp, clarifying question. "Did he ever ask if you were medically trained before he ordered you to move?" "No. I told him I was a nurse, but he didn't seem to care," Sarah replied. "Did he assess the patient himself?" "No. He never even looked at him." "Did he read you your Miranda rights?" "No." "Did he state what investigation you were obstructing?" "No. He just kept saying he was securing the scene." When Sarah finished, Eleanor clicked her pen and looked down at her notes for a long moment. The silence stretched, filled only by the low hum of the building's ventilation. Finally, she looked up, and for the first time, Sarah saw a glimmer of something beyond professional detachment in her eyes. Cold, controlled fury. "This is not a gray area." "Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice low and firm. "Under Louisiana's Good Samaritan laws, and under the established duty of care for a medical professional, you were legally and ethically obligated to render aid. What Officer Renslow did was not just a violation of your civil rights. It was a flagrant interference with emergency medical care. He substituted his authority for medical necessity, and in doing so, he abandoned the patient himself." She closed her notepad. "The arrest is unlawful. The charges are baseless. We'll have you released within the hour. But this doesn't end here. This isn't just about getting you out of this room. This is about ensuring that no other nurse, paramedic, or doctor is ever put in the position of choosing between their patient and a pair of handcuffs." Eleanor Vance wasn't just an attorney. She was an advocate, and in that small, sterile interview room, she had just turned Sarah's personal nightmare into the front line of a much larger battle. True to her word, Eleanor Vance moved with formidable speed. The conversation with the district attorney's on-call prosecutor was apparently short and pointed. Within 45 minutes, Sergeant Miller was unlocking the cell door, his expression one of weary resignation. "You're being released, Miss Jones. Released on your own recognizance. The D.A. will review the arresting officer's report, but I wouldn't expect to hear from them." It was as close to an apology as he was likely to give. Stepping out of the precinct and back onto Royal Street was a jarring transition. The late afternoon sun was still bright, casting long shadows across the pavement. The city was still alive with the sounds of music and laughter, utterly oblivious to the drama that had consumed her day. Her own ambulance would have been parked across the street, but it was her day off. Her car was miles away. She felt adrift. Her purse and phone, retrieved from the scene by another officer, were handed back to her. As she turned her phone on, it immediately buzzed to life with a cascade of missed calls and text messages from colleagues, friends, and her unit supervisor. The news had spread like wildfire through the city's tight-knit medical community. Eleanor Vance stood beside her on the sidewalk, already on her own phone. "I understand. Keep me updated on his condition," she said, her voice tense. She ended the call and turned to Sarah. "That was my contact at Tulane Medical Center. Your patient, Michael Evans, is out of surgery. He's alive." Sarah closed her eyes, a wave of profound relief washing over her. "Oh, thank God." But Eleanor's expression was grim, stopping Sarah's relief cold. "He's alive, but it's not good news. He survived the initial cardiac arrest, but the surgeon found he'd suffered a severe anoxic brain injury." The clinical term hit Sarah like a physical blow. Anoxic brain injury. Damage from a lack of oxygen. She knew exactly what it meant. She knew the devastating, often permanent consequences. "How severe?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "They don't know the full extent yet. He's in a medically induced coma in the ICU," Eleanor continued, her voice softening slightly. "The ER doctor who received him was explicit. The interruption in CPR, the time between when Renslow pulled you off him and when the paramedics were able to restart compressions and defibrillate, was critical. He coded twice in the ER. The doctor said those 90 seconds of no blood flow likely made the difference between a full recovery and this." The weight of those words settled on Sarah, heavier than any physical restraint. It wasn't just about a wrongful arrest anymore. It wasn't a matter of principle. It was about tangible, irreversible harm. The abstract legal conflict had a human cost, and his name was Michael Evans. The image of his gray, still face flashed in her mind. She had been fighting for his life, and in the most crucial moments, she had been torn away. The victory of being released from jail now felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge that her patient was lying in an ICU bed. His future stolen from him by an officer's fatal miscalculation. David Chen, the paramedic from the scene, pulled up to the curb in his personal car. He'd just gotten off his shift. He got out and gave Sarah a brief, supportive hug. "I can't believe he did that," David murmured, his voice tight with anger. "We all saw it. The whole square saw it. You were doing everything right." "How was he in the field?" Sarah asked, her nurse's mind desperate for the clinical details. "He was in V-fib. We shocked him 3 times before we got a rhythm back, right before we loaded him up," David explained. "But that delay, Sarah, it cost him. You could see it." She nodded, a cold dread seeping into her bones. This was the reality of her release. Not a clean slate, but an entry into a new, uncertain chapter where the consequences of Officer Renslow's actions were still unfolding. She was free, but Michael Evans was in a coma. The fight wasn't over. It had just taken on a new, more tragic dimension. Eleanor Vance watched her, her expression one of grim determination. She knew what this meant for the legal battle to come. The stakes had just been raised exponentially. This was no longer just a case of false arrest. It was a case of catastrophic, life-altering negligence. The days that followed Sarah's release were a blur of meetings and phone calls. Eleanor Vance's office became a second home, a sanctuary of focused legal strategy in the midst of the emotional storm, the district attorney's office. As Sergeant Miller had predicted, formally dropped the charges against her within 48 hours. It was a quiet, unceremonious email, a tacit admission of the arrest's illegitimacy, but it offered no sense of closure. Michael Evans was still in a coma, his prognosis grim. His family had flown in from Ohio, their lives upended, and were now keeping a vigil at his bedside, grappling with the terrible uncertainty of his future. Eleanor was methodical, building her case with the precision of a surgeon. She gathered sworn affidavits from David Chen and his partner. She had an investigator tracking down dozens of people who had recorded the incident on their phones. Collecting a mountain of digital evidence, she filed the official complaint in federal court, Sarah Jones versus Officer Mark Renslow and the City of New Orleans. The charges were stark: violation of civil rights under the 4th and 14th Amendments, false arrest, and, most critically, intentional interference with the provision of emergency medical services. The city's first response came a week later. It wasn't a formal legal answer, but a call from their municipal attorney to Eleanor. It was a classic opening gambit. "They're trying to frame this as a simple misunderstanding at a chaotic scene," Eleanor told Sarah during a meeting in her high-rise office overlooking the Mississippi River. "They're offering to settle $25,000 and a formal apology from the NOPD." Sarah stared at her. The amount was so paltry, so dismissive of the gravity of what had happened, that it was insulting. It was nuisance value, the cost of making a problem go away quietly. $25,000? She repeated, her voice incredulous. "A man is in a coma. His family might have to care for him for the rest of his life, and they think this is worth the price of a used car?" "It's not about what they think it's worth," Eleanor explained, her voice calm. "It's about what they think they can get away with. They want to bury this. They want to avoid the headlines, protect the officer, and prevent this from setting a precedent. They are betting that you will be tired, intimidated, and willing to take a quick payday to put this behind you." A fire ignited in Sarah's chest, burning away any trace of fear or hesitation. This was never about money. From the moment the handcuffs had clicked shut, it had been about a fundamental principle. Now, hearing the city's dismissive offer, that principle became razor-sharp. It was about accountability. It was about ensuring that the line between a police officer's authority and a medical professional's duty was drawn in bright, unerasable ink. "No," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm. "Absolutely not." A slow smile spread across Eleanor Vance's face. It was the answer she had expected, the one she had been hoping for. "That's what I told them you'd say," she replied. "I told them we weren't interested in their apology or their pocket change. I told them we are interested in policy change. We are interested in mandatory training protocols. We are interested in a jury of 12 citizens hearing exactly what Officer Renslow did on that sunny afternoon." She leaned forward, her eyes locking with Sarah's. "So, we're proceeding to discovery. We're going to get Renslow's personnel file, his training records, every complaint ever filed against him. We're going to subpoena the NOPD's policies on interacting with emergency personnel, and we are going to depose Officer Renslow under oath. And we are going to make him explain to us, word by word, why his need to control a crowd was more important than a man's life." The rejection of the settlement was a declaration of war. It signaled that this wouldn't be a quiet backroom deal. It would be a public fight, not just for compensation, but for a fundamental reevaluation of duty, authority, and the sacred space around a patient in need. The city had tried to buy silence, but instead, they had guaranteed a storm. The discovery phase of a lawsuit is often a slow, tedious process of exchanging documents and legal filings. But in this case, it was an avalanche. Eleanor's investigator had been incredibly successful. The incident in Jackson Square had not been witnessed by a few dozen people. It had been recorded by them. The investigator returned with over 30 separate video files, sourced from tourists, street performers, and local residents who had all pointed their phones at the unfolding drama. Eleanor's legal team synced the videos, creating a stunning, multi-angle mosaic of the entire event. It was like watching a meticulously choreographed scene from a dozen different perspectives. They could track every moment, from Michael Evans's collapse to Sarah's immediate, decisive action to the arrival of Officer Renslow. The footage was more damning than any single witness testimony could ever be. One video, shot from a balcony overlooking the square, provided a clear, wide-angle view. It showed Renslow striding into the scene, his attention immediately going to the perimeter, barely glancing at the man on the ground. It showed him gesturing for Sarah to move, and her shaking her head, never once breaking the rhythm of her life-saving compressions. Another video, shot from just a few feet away, captured the audio with chilling clarity. Renslow's sharp, escalating commands, Sarah's strained, panting explanations, her final desperate plea. "You're going to kill him!" The click of the handcuffs was audible, a sharp, percussive sound that made everyone in Eleanor's conference room flinch when they first heard it. The video showed Sarah's face, a mask of disbelief and anguish. As she was pulled away, most importantly, it showed the horrifying stillness of Michael Evans in the interval before the paramedics arrived. The footage transformed an abstract period of time, 90 seconds, into a visceral, agonizing eternity. The city's attorneys had to have known how bad it looked, but they were legally obligated to proceed. They provided Officer Renslow's personnel file. It was revealing. In his 5 years on the force, Renslow had accumulated 4 civilian complaints for abuse of authority and unprofessional conduct. All had been dismissed internally with a finding of unsubstantiated. But the pattern was there. He was an officer with a history of escalating minor confrontations, of seeing challenges to his authority where none existed. His performance reviews praised his proactive policing and command presence, but also noted a need for improved de-escalation skills. In contrast, the discovery process for Sarah was a testament to her professionalism. Her nursing license was immaculate. Her employment records from Tulane were filled with commendations. Her colleagues, in their affidavits, described her as one of the most competent, calm, and dedicated nurses in the ICU. The picture being painted for the court was one of stark, undeniable contrast, a decorated, life-saving professional against a young, overzealous officer with a history of complaints. The videos began to leak. An anonymous source sent one of the clearest clips to a local news station. Within hours, it was everywhere. It went from local news to national cable channels to viral clips on social media, shared millions of times under hashtags like #NurseArrest and #Letterwork. The court of public opinion delivered its verdict long before a jury could be assembled. The image of a nurse in handcuffs, pulled away from a dying man by a police officer, was a powerful, infuriating symbol that resonated across the country. The city's legal department was now in full-blown crisis mode. The quiet, $25,000 problem had metastasized into a national public relations disaster. The unblinking eye of public scrutiny was now fixed on them, and the mountain of digital evidence was irrefutable. They were no longer just facing a lawsuit, they were facing a public reckoning, all captured in high definition from 30 different angles. The pressure to make this go away, at any cost, was becoming immense. The deposition was held in a sterile, soulless conference room in a downtown law office. Officer Mark Renslow arrived flanked by 2 attorneys from the city, their expressions a mixture of grim resolve and apprehension. He wore a crisp suit, a stark contrast to the uniform he'd worn on the day of the incident. He looked confident, almost defiant, but a subtle tension in his jaw betrayed the pressure he was under. Sarah was there, sitting beside Eleanor Vance. Eleanor had insisted she attend. "I want you to be there," she had said, "and I want him to see you." A court reporter sat at the head of the table, her fingers poised over her stenotype machine. ready to capture every word for the official record. For the next 7 hours, that conference room would be Eleanor Vance's courtroom, and she was the judge, prosecutor, and jury. She began calmly, establishing the basic facts of the day. Renslow's answers were short and rehearsed, sticking closely to the narrative in his police report. He described arriving at a chaotic and uncontrolled scene and taking standard steps to ensure public safety and create a perimeter for incoming emergency services. Then Eleanor's questions began to sharpen, each one a precision tool designed to dismantle his defense. Officer Renslow, in your report, you state that Ms. Jones was obstructing your efforts. What specific efforts was she obstructing? She was refusing to clear the area, which was preventing me from establishing a sterile scene for the paramedics, Renslow replied. His voice even, "A sterile scene," Eleanor repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "Are you a paramedic, officer?" "No, I am not. Do you have any advanced medical training, EMT certification, for example?" "I have the standard first aid and CPR training provided by the police academy." "And in that training, were you ever taught that a necessary first step in responding to a cardiac arrest is to clear away the person who is actively performing CPR?" One of the city's attorneys objected. Argumentative. "I'll rephrase," Eleanor said smoothly, never taking her eyes off Renslow. "Officer, did you at any point assess the medical condition of the man on the ground?" "My priority was scene control," Renslow repeated, the phrase becoming his mantra. "That's not my question. Did you check for a pulse? Did you check his breathing? Did you look at the color of his skin?" "I observed the scene as a whole," he hedged. "So you did not, in fact, make any medical assessment of Mr. Evans?" "I am not a paramedic," he said, a note of frustration creeping into his voice. "Exactly," Eleanor said, her voice dropping slightly. "You are not a paramedic. But Ms. Jones, who told you repeatedly she was a registered nurse, is a medical professional. Did you consider for even a moment that she might have a better understanding of the patient's immediate needs than you did?" Renslow sat in silence, his jaw tight. Eleanor pressed on, her questioning relentless. "Ms. Jones told you the man was in full cardiac arrest, correct?" "She said something to that effect." "And you understood what that meant? That his heart had stopped? That he was clinically dead?" "I understood it was a serious medical situation." "And you still believed the most important? Life-saving action you could take in that moment was to pull the trained medical professional away from him?" "I was following procedure." "Show me the procedure." "Officer Renslow," Eleanor interrupted, her voice like ice. "Show me the NOPD manual page that instructs an officer to arrest a nurse for performing CPR. Show me the guideline that says establishing a perimeter takes precedence over chest compressions. You can't. Can you? Because it doesn't exist." For 7 hours, she picked apart his testimony, exposing his profound lack of medical understanding, his rigid adherence to a misapplied protocol, and his inability to adapt to the reality of the situation. By the end of the day, his confident facade had crumbled, replaced by the sullen defensiveness of a man who knew he was cornered. The deposition transcript was a disaster for the city. It wasn't just a record of a mistake. It was a 7-hour-long confession of negligence, arrogance, and a catastrophic failure of judgment, all captured in the cold, black-and-white finality of a court reporter's record. The fallout from the deposition was immediate and severe. The transcript, combined with the viral videos, created a legal position for the city that was not just weak, but utterly indefensible. They had a police officer, under oath, admitting that he had no medical basis for his actions and that he had prioritized a vaguely defined scene control over a nurse's direct, life-saving intervention. The city's lead attorney called Eleanor Vance the next morning. The tone was no longer dismissive or condescending. It was the sound of desperation. "They know they're going to lose," Eleanor told Sarah, recapping the call. "And they know it's going to be bad. A jury is going to see those videos. They're going to read that deposition. And they are going to be furious. The city's liability is massive." The new offer reflected that fear. The city was now proposing a settlement of $2 million. It was a staggering increase from their initial offer, a clear signal that they were willing to pay a significant sum to prevent the case from ever reaching a courtroom. The offer also came with a condition, a non-disclosure agreement that would bar Sarah and her attorneys from ever speaking publicly about the case or the settlement terms again. "They're not just trying to compensate you anymore," Eleanor explained, her expression serious. "They're trying to buy your silence. They want to write a check, bury the story, and avoid the one thing they fear more than a big verdict: systemic change." They met in Eleanor's office to discuss the offer. $2 million was a life-changing amount of money. It was enough to ensure Sarah would never have to worry about finances again. She could pay off her home, help her family, travel the world. The temptation was real. A siren call promising an end to the stress, the public scrutiny, the emotional toll the case had taken on her. She could simply sign the papers and walk away, leaving the trauma of that day behind her forever. She thought about Michael Evans, still in the hospital, now transferred to a long-term care facility. He had emerged from the coma, but, as predicted, the anoxic brain injury had left him severely impaired. He had trouble with memory, with speech, with basic motor functions. His life, and the lives of his family, had been irrevocably altered. He would never be the man he was before that afternoon in Jackson Square. Then she thought about the principle that had driven her from the beginning. If she took the money and signed the NDA, what would change? Officer Renslow might face some internal discipline, but the underlying problem, the lack of clear protocols, the culture that allowed an officer to believe his authority superseded a medical emergency, would remain. Another nurse, another paramedic, could find themselves in the exact same position, facing the same impossible choice. The settlement would fix her problem, but it would leave the systemic flaw in place. "It's not enough," Sarah said, looking out the window at the city below. Eleanor looked at her, a glimmer of pride in her eyes. "The money isn't enough, or the terms aren't right." "The terms," Sarah clarified. "The money is... it's a lot. But the silence, the NDA... I can't do that. This can't be for nothing. It has to mean something. We need policy changes. We need guarantees that this won't happen again. If we have to go to trial to get that, then that's what we do." She was turning down a fortune, choosing the uncertainty and stress of a public trial over the quiet comfort of a private settlement. It was a brave, terrifying decision. She was betting everything on the belief that a jury would not only see the injustice done to her, but would also recognize the need to protect every first responder who might one day stand in her shoes. Eleanor picked up the phone to call the city's attorney. "My client rejects your offer," she would say. "We'll see you in court." The city's desperate gambit to quietly resolve their catastrophic mistake had failed. The stage was now set for a public trial that would put not just one officer, but the entire city's emergency response protocol under the harsh glare of a federal courtroom. The day the trial began, the federal courthouse was surrounded by news vans, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky like a strange, metallic forest. The case of the arrested nurse had captured the public's imagination, tapping into a deep-seated respect for medical professionals and a growing mistrust of unchecked authority. Sarah, dressed in a simple, professional navy blue suit, walked through a gauntlet of cameras and shouted questions, her hand held steady by Eleanor Vance. Inside, the courtroom was packed. The jury, a carefully selected panel of 7 women and 5 men, sat with sober expressions, aware of the gravity of the case before them. Officer Mark Renslow sat at the defense table, looking smaller and younger than he had in the deposition room, the weight of the proceedings seeming to press down on him. After the preliminary motions, it was time for opening statements. The city's attorney went first, painting a picture of a chaotic, dangerous scene. He portrayed Renslow as a dedicated officer trying his best to restore order and protect the public in a rapidly evolving situation. He characterized Sarah as a well-meaning but ultimately uncooperative civilian who, in her emotional state, had failed to understand the need for police procedure. It was a narrative designed to muddy the waters, to create just enough doubt. Then, Eleanor Vance rose and walked to the lectern. She stood in silence for a long moment, making eye contact with each member of the jury. When she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and resonant. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began. "On the afternoon of May 17th, 2 duties collided in Jackson Square. The first was the sacred duty of a nurse to save a human life. The second was the duty of a police officer to protect the public. This case is about what happens when one of those duties is wrongfully, tragically, and catastrophically prioritized over the other." She walked slowly in front of the jury box, her presence commanding. "You will hear from witnesses who will describe a scene not of chaos, but of a single focused act of heroism. You will see with your own eyes on video Sarah Jones, a highly skilled ICU nurse, performing CPR on a dying man. Michael Evans, she was his only hope. She was the thin line between life and death." "And then," Eleanor continued, her voice hardening, "you will see Officer Mark Renslow arrive. You will see that he did not rush to help. He did not assess the patient. He did not ask if assistance was needed. He saw only one thing: a challenge to his absolute authority. He saw a woman who would not obey his command, and he decided, in that moment, that punishing her insubordination was more important than the life of the man she was trying to save." She paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle in the silent courtroom. "The defense will tell you this was about procedure. They will talk about scene control. But we will prove that this was not about procedure. This was about ego. It was about an officer who could not tolerate being told no, even when that no was in the service of saving a man's life. Over the course of this trial," she concluded, her voice ringing with conviction, "we will ask you to answer a simple but profound question. In a medical emergency, who is in charge of the patient? The trained medical professional with their hands on the person's chest, or the police officer with his hand on a pair of handcuffs? The evidence will show that Sarah Jones made the right choice, and the evidence will show that Officer Renslow made a choice so catastrophically wrong that it not only violated a citizen's rights, but it nearly cost another citizen his life. Thank you." She walked back to her table and sat down. The courtroom was still, the jury's eyes fixed on her. She hadn't just outlined a legal case. She had framed a moral referendum. The gavel fell. The first witness was called, and the battle for accountability had officially begun. The first few days of the trial were dedicated to building the narrative. David Chen, the paramedic, testified about arriving at the scene to find Sarah in handcuffs and the patient without CPR. Bystanders who had filmed the incident took the stand. Their videos played on large screens for the jury to see, each clip reinforcing the timeline of events. But the emotional turning point of the trial came on the 3rd day, when Eleanor Vance called Dr. Robert Cole to the stand Doctor. Cole was the head of the emergency department at Tulane Medical Center, a man in his late 50s with a calming presence and an air of unimpeachable authority. He was the physician who had been on duty when Michael Evans was brought in. Eleanor led him through his credentials and his experience before turning to the events of that day. Dr. Cole, can you describe Mr. Evans's condition upon his arrival in your emergency department? He was in extremis, Doctor. Cole stated, his voice clinical and precise. He was intubated in the field. His heart was in a very unstable rhythm, and his vital signs were profoundly unstable. He was, to be blunt, on the verge of death. The paramedics' report indicates a significant delay in the field. Were you made aware of that? Eleanor asked. Yes. The report, and the paramedics themselves, noted an interruption in chest compressions of approximately 90 seconds to 2 minutes due to the intervention of a police officer. The city's attorney shot up. Objection. Hearsay. Sustained. The jury will disregard the witness's characterization of the event. The judge instructed. Eleanor was unfazed. Let me rephrase. Doctor, based on your medical expertise, what is the effect of a 2-minute interruption of CPR on a patient in cardiac arrest? Doctor. Cole turned his attention to the jury, his role shifting from witness to educator. To understand that, you have to understand what CPR does. It does not restart the heart. It serves one primary function, to manually pump oxygenated blood to the brain to keep the brain cells alive. The brain is incredibly sensitive to a lack of oxygen. After about 4 to 6 minutes without blood flow, irreversible brain damage begins. That damage accelerates with every second that passes. He paused, letting the jury absorb the information. A 2-minute interruption for a patient who has already been in arrest for several minutes is not just a delay. It is a catastrophic event. It's like holding someone underwater for an extra 2 minutes after they've already run out of air. The damage done in those moments is exponential. And in Mr. Evans's case, Eleanor pressed, what was the damage? Mr. Evans suffered a severe anoxic brain injury. Doctor, Cole said, the words landing with heavy finality. We were eventually able to stabilize his heart, but the damage to his brain had been done. That period of no blood flow, as described in the medical record, is the direct and proximate cause of his current neurological condition. Eleanor walked closer to the witness stand. Doctor, in your expert medical opinion, if CPR had not been interrupted, would Mr. Evans's outcome likely have been different? Objection, speculation, the city's attorney called out. Overruled. The witness is a qualified expert. The judge countered. He may answer. Doctor. Cole looked directly at the jury. While no outcome is ever certain in medicine, it is my professional opinion, with a very high degree of medical certainty, that had continuous, high-quality CPR been maintained from the moment Ms. Jones started until the paramedics were able to defibrillate, his chances of a neurologically intact survival would have been dramatically, and I mean dramatically, higher. Those 2 minutes were the difference between him walking out of the hospital and him living the rest of his life in a state of severe disability. The testimony was devastating. It stripped away all the legal arguments about procedure and authority and replaced them with the cold, hard science of life and death. Doctor. Cole hadn't offered an opinion. He had presented a medical fact. And that fact was that Officer Renslow's actions had directly caused catastrophic, permanent harm. A hush fell over the courtroom as he stepped down from the stand. The jury's faces were grim. They now understood the true stakes of what had happened in Jackson Square. The final witness was Sarah Jones herself. When Eleanor called her to the stand, a quiet confidence had settled over her. The fear and uncertainty had been replaced by a resolve to simply tell her story. She walked past the defense table, her gaze briefly meeting Officer Renslow's. There was no anger in her look, only a profound sadness for the damage his choice had caused. Eleanor's questioning was gentle, allowing Sarah to narrate the events in her own words. She didn't sound like a victim or an activist. She sounded like a nurse. She described her actions in clinical terms, explaining the why behind every decision. "Ms. Jones, why didn't you simply stop CPR when the officer ordered you to?" Eleanor asked. "Because it would have been a death sentence," Sarah replied simply. "My duty as a nurse, my ethical obligation, and frankly, my basic human instinct was to the patient. He was my responsibility in that moment. Nothing else mattered more than keeping him alive." "Were you trying to obstruct Officer Renslow?" "No," Sarah said, shaking her head. "I was trying to save a life. I believed we were on the same team, with the same goal. I never imagined one of us would arrest the other for doing their job." The cross-examination by the city's attorney was aggressive. He tried to paint her as an arrogant rule-breaker, someone who thought her judgment was superior to that of law enforcement. "So you believe you have the right to ignore a direct order from a police officer?" he challenged. "I believe I have a duty to not abandon my patient in a life-or-death situation," Sarah countered calmly. "My license, my training, and the law all support that duty. You could have just stepped aside and let the paramedics, the real first responders, handle it when they arrived, couldn't you?" "The paramedics were not there yet," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "I was, and in a cardiac arrest. The person who is there is the first responder. Every second counts. There was no time to wait." Her testimony was powerful in its simplicity and professionalism. She was not emotional or accusatory. She was a competent professional, explaining the clear-cut realities of her job. When she stepped down, the jury saw her not as a plaintiff seeking money, but as a dedicated caregiver who had been unjustly punished for upholding her oath. Closing arguments were a final, stark summary of the two opposing worldviews. The defense argued for order and compliance, portraying a world where police authority must be absolute to prevent chaos. Eleanor Vance argued for reason and humanity, for a world where professional duty and the preservation of life could not be overridden by a badge. "Send a message," Eleanor urged the jury in her final words. "Send a message that when a life is on the line, we expect our public servants to help, not hinder. Send a message that the sacred duty of a healer will be protected. Send a message to Sarah Jones that what she did was not a crime, but an act of courage." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces were set and unanimous. Sarah held her breath, her hand gripping Eleanor's under the table. The foreman, a middle-aged woman, handed the verdict form to the clerk. The judge read it over, his expression unreadable, before handing it back. "In the matter of Jones versus the City of New Orleans and Officer Mark Renslow," the clerk announced, her voice echoing in the silent room. "On the count of violation of civil rights, we the jury find for the plaintiff, Sarah Jones." A quiet gasp went through the courtroom. "On the count of false arrest, we find for the plaintiff, Sarah Jones." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. "And for damages," the clerk continued, taking a breath, "we the jury award the plaintiff compensatory and punitive damages in the amount of $12,800,000. The number was so staggering it seemed to suck the air out of the room. It was more than a verdict. It was a thunderous rebuke, a statement of overwhelming community outrage. Sarah broke down, sobbing quietly into her hands, not for the money, but for the profound, absolute validation. The jury hadn't just believed her, they had championed her. It was a victory for her, for Michael Evans's family, and for every first responder who had ever been told their duty to save a life came second to anything else. The record-breaking verdict was a seismic event for the city of New Orleans. It dominated headlines locally and nationally, sparking a fierce debate about police training, authority, and the proper way for different emergency services to interact. The $12.8 million figure wasn't just a number, it was a clear, unmistakable message from the community that the NOPD's conduct was unacceptable and its failure in judgment had a steep price. For Officer Mark Renslow, the consequences were swift and final. The NOPD's Internal Affairs Division, which had been conducting its own parallel investigation, concluded its review a week after the verdict. Faced with the jury's decision, the mountain of video evidence, and the disastrous deposition, their findings were inevitable. Renslow was found to have violated multiple department policies, including abuse of authority, unprofessional conduct, and failure to render aid. He was terminated from the New Orleans Police Department, his 5-year career ending in public disgrace. But Sarah and Eleanor had fought for more than a monetary award and the firing of a single officer. They had fought for systemic change, with the leverage of the massive verdict. Eleanor Vance entered into post-trial negotiations with the city. The city, facing the prospect of a lengthy and expensive appeals process they were almost certain to lose, was finally ready to listen. The result was a landmark agreement. In addition to paying the verdict, the city of New Orleans agreed to a sweeping reform of its police protocols. The centerpiece of this reform was a new directive, officially titled General Order 501. 5. Interaction with medical personnel at emergency scenes. Unofficially, everyone at the NOPD, the fire department, and EMS knew it by another name, the Jones Rule. The Jones Rule was clear and unambiguous. It explicitly stated that at any scene of a medical emergency, the primary authority over patient care rested with the most qualified medical personnel on scene, regardless of whether they were on-duty paramedics, firefighters, or off-duty medical professionals acting as good Samaritans. It mandated that police officers were not to interfere with active, life-saving treatment, such as CPR, for any reason, including administrative tasks like securing a perimeter or requesting identification. An officer's role was to support medical efforts by managing crowds, ensuring safety, and assisting when asked. Any deviation from this protocol, especially one that resulted in a delay of care, would trigger an automatic internal affairs investigation. The agreement didn't stop there. The city committed to a complete overhaul of its police academy training on the subject. Every NOPD recruit would now undergo mandatory training co-led by senior paramedics and nurses. They would be drilled on recognizing medical emergencies, understanding the critical importance of the chain of survival, and learning how to effectively integrate with, rather than command, other first responders. The bystander videos from Sarah's arrest became a central part of that training, a permanent case study in exactly what not to do. For Sarah, these policy changes were the true victory. The money was a means to an end, a tool that had forced the city to the negotiating table. But the Jones Rule was the legacy. It was a concrete, structural change that would protect future patients and future caregivers. It was a shield for the next nurse who dropped to their knees to help a stranger, ensuring they would be seen as an ally, not an obstacle. The price of Officer Renslow's mistake had been steep, not just in dollars, but in the permanent damage to Michael Evans's life. But from that tragedy, a new rule was born, a dawn of clarity and protection forged in the fires of a wrongful arrest and a fight for what was right. Years passed. The national spotlight on the case faded, as it always does, replaced by new headlines and new outrages. But the impact of Sarah's stand remained, woven into the fabric of emergency response culture not just in New Orleans, but across the country. The Jones Rule became a model for other police departments looking to reform their own protocols. The story of the Jackson Square arrest became a fixture in textbooks for paramedics, nurses, and police cadets alike. The video footage, once a viral sensation, became a standard teaching tool. In medical schools, it was used to illustrate the ethical imperative of patient advocacy. In police academies, it was a stark lesson on the limits of authority and the critical need for situational awareness. Legal scholars used it to discuss civil rights and qualified immunity. The 9 minutes of raw, chaotic footage from that afternoon had become one of the most important training documents in modern emergency services. Sarah Jones did not become a full-time activist or a public speaker. She didn't write a book or sell the rights to her story. After a brief, necessary leave of absence, she returned to her job in the ICU at Tulane Medical Center. She went back to 12-hour shifts, to the quiet, intense work of caring for the city's most critically ill patients. That was who she was. The work was her calling, and the courtroom had been a detour, not a destination. She used a significant portion of the settlement to create a charitable foundation. It provided financial support to the families of patients who suffered catastrophic medical events, helping them navigate the overwhelming costs of long-term care. The first beneficiary of the fund was the family of Michael Evans. The money helped provide him with the best possible care, easing the immense financial burden his condition had created. He would never fully recover, but the support allowed his family to focus on his comfort and quality of life. He and Sarah never met after the incident, but his wife sent Sarah a card every year on the anniversary of the trial, a simple, heartfelt note of gratitude for her courage. The real legacy of her choice wasn't something you could quantify in dollars or list in a policy manual. It was in the thousands of daily interactions at emergency scenes across the country that now went differently. It was the police officer who arrived at a car wreck and immediately asked the EMT, "What do you need from me?" It was the fire captain who deferred to a paramedic's judgment on patient extraction. It was the off-duty doctor who could render aid at a public park without fear of being arrested for refusing to move. One choice, made in a split second on a hot afternoon, had created a ripple effect that protected countless first responders and the patients they served. Sarah's refusal to abandon her patient was not just a single act of defiance. It was a precedent. It affirmed that the space around a patient is sacred, and the duty to heal is paramount. It was a battle fought once, in a very public and painful way, so that thousands of others wouldn't have to fight it again. That was her victory. Not the money, not the fame, but the quiet, unseen protection her courage had purchased for others. It's tempting to paint the story's antagonist, Officer Mark Renslow, as a villain. But the truth, as is often the case, is more complicated and perhaps more unsettling. His actions were not born of evil, but of a systemic flaw magnified by individual insecurity. Renslow was a product of a policing culture that, at the time, often equated control with safety and compliance with respect. He was a young officer, under 40, likely driven by a desire to prove his competence and command on a public stage. When faced with a chaotic scene and a direct challenge to his authority from Sarah, his training, and perhaps his ego, defaulted to a rigid, zero-sum response. He saw a problem of insubordination to be quashed, failing completely to recognize the far more critical medical problem he was exacerbating. He wasn't trying to harm Michael Evans. In his tragically misguided worldview, he was simply doing his job. Could Sarah have done anything differently to de-escalate the situation? Perhaps. In a perfect world, a less direct no and a more collaborative tone might have soothed a fragile ego. If she had been wearing scrubs or a jacket that identified her as a nurse, It might have given Renslow the visual cue he needed to pause and reassess, but in the heat of a cardiac arrest, with a man's life draining away under her hands, the expectation of such delicate emotional navigation is an unfair burden. Her focus was exactly where it needed to be, on her patient. The failure was not in her response, but in a system that created an officer incapable of recognizing her priority as the correct one. The ultimate lesson from that day in Jackson Square is a profound one about the nature of true authority. It teaches us that legitimate authority is not merely claimed by a uniform or a badge, it is earned through competence, reason, and a correct understanding of one's role in a crisis. Sarah's authority as a caregiver was absolute in that moment because it was directly tied to the preservation of life, Renslow's authority, when he tried to impose it against that higher duty, became illegitimate. This story is a testament to the courage it takes to stand firm in your professional and moral convictions, even when faced with the immense power of the state. It is a reminder that the most heroic acts are often not about grand gestures, but about the simple, unwavering refusal to do the wrong thing. What do you think is the best way to train officers to differentiate between a challenge to their authority and a professional exercising a higher duty? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to stand up to an authority figure to do what you knew was right? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And please support the channel so we can continue to bring you these important stories.